Imagine living in a free country, and then suddenly one day, communist revolutionaries are out in the street and they are working to overthrow your liberty-minded constitution and replace it with a totalitarian one. I'm not talking about America yet. I'm talking about Chile. And with us today, we have a friend of mine who's also the John Birch Society coordinator for the Rocky Mountains Plains region. Her name is Leah Southwell, and she just got back not too long ago from Chile after having experienced exactly what I just described. So we're very happy to have her with us here in the studio. We're going to talk more about solutions to the deep state problem and also some of what happened in Chile as a lesson to what Americans might face and what we can do about it. Leah, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
So tell us your story in a nutshell. You moved down to Chile, 8 years ago, something like that, and everything was nice, and Chile was a liberty-minded country. They had overthrown the communists decades ago, and now they're back.
That's right. Yeah, I chose Chile because it was the seventh economically freest nation in the world when I moved there 8 years ago. I thought they were prospering. I saw nothing but opportunity everywhere. It was a peaceful country, nonviolent. And yes, there were some people protesting. They wanted free education. You could see the unions were always pushing for socialism. But I didn't think anybody was taking it very seriously. And I was quite happy with my life. And overnight, on October 18th, 2019, the subway system came under attack. 70 of the train stations were attacked, burnt, destroyed. Trains on the subway line were destroyed. And then they started burning the public transportation system in the way of the buses. And then they started attacking the stores and looting and rioting and burning, worse than anything we've seen here in the U.S.
Wow, we were actually supposed to come down and see you.
That's right.
Not long after that began, and of course the United Nations ended up moving their conference over to Madrid. But so tell us how that happened, Leah. How did it go just from normal, peaceful country with a few grumpy people to almost overnight, just the cities are in flames and everything's going crazy?
I think, as you know, you just need a spark. And the spark was an increase in the public transportation system of 4 cents.
Oh, my goodness.
And so the high school students were out at the subway stations. They were avoiding and jumping the turnstiles and saying they weren't going to pay. And then we started to see a little bit of destruction happening in the subway system. And we've even got pictures of the students with teachers there. And so I think it was promoted amongst the youth and perhaps some of the teachers who got them to go out and start doing the damage. And then overnight, it escalated to massive attacks. We did find out later that the accelerant that was used in these attacks was not from Chile. It had been brought in from outside of the country. So that's when you start to say, was this a terrorist attack and who was behind it?
Wow, and I've noticed that same thing in multiple countries. In fact, I've recorded on camera protests of children with teachers directing them. I've seen it in Scandinavia. I've seen it here in the United States. The teachers, radicalized teachers guiding this. You had a pretty crazy experience, I understand, involving a piece of wood and having to defend yourself. Would you just tell us how extreme this guy?
Yeah. It wasn't really to defend myself. It was to defend my neighborhood. Okay. So a lot of the fighting was going on in areas outside of mine. I lived in the area called Santiago, Manhattan. So it was the business district where all the tall skyscrapers are, and a pretty good area. And so the police had managed to keep them out most of the time. But twice they decided to come into my neighborhood, and I turned into a mama bear.
Your kids were down there with you.
My kids were down there with me, too. And one day they were going to attack where my supermarket was, which is the tallest building in all of Latin America, 77 stories tall. And in the basement was my grocery store. I didn't have a car. It was the only grocery store I could walk to. And, you know, you don't tick off a angry mama bear and threaten her grocery store. But this building was constantly under attack because it was the symbolism of capitalism. So if they could watch a 77-story tall tower burn, that would be their ultimate. So one day, I lived only 2 blocks away from this building. One day they were assembling to fight the police to get to this building. And the police were on one side of the street and the protesters were on my side of the street in my neighborhood. And I just thought, I'm not going to let this happen. So in my crazy mind, I stepped in front of one of the loudest agitators agitators who were cussing and cursing at the police. And I said, what do you think you're going to accomplish by doing this, by burning down your whole city? And he said, lady, you don't understand it. And I said, what don't I understand? He says, lady, this is a revolution. We got to burn it down before we can rebuild it. And then with 40 people yelling and cursing at me while I'm standing there, I decided I think this might be a good time to back out. So I did. And then just a little bit away from that, there was a young kid. He was probably 16 years old. And again, had my mama hat on, and he had a big 2x4 that he was banging on a bike rack. And I said, what are you going to do with that? And he didn't answer me. And I said, nothing good, right? I said, give me the stick. I had to say it 3 times and get really stern with him. I said, give me the stick. And he actually did give me the stick, and I took it home with me to prevent him from smashing in some police officers' heads or some windows with it.
Oh, my goodness. What a story. And let's talk about the background a little bit, because I grew up with the same nonsense that Pinochet was a dictator. Then I started talking to some Chileans in Miami. Like, oh, no. Yeah, actually, we had an advertiser in a newspaper. I started, Pinochet was wonderful. He saved us from a brutal communist tyranny. Like, wait, but that's not what I heard. And then recently, I was reading a wonderful book that was put together by the New American 20th Century Heroes, and one of the guys listed in there was Pinochet, and got some more background. But so for people out there who've only heard the deep state's version of history, that Pinochet was this horrible dictator who overthrew a democratically elected government, give us the backstory. What really happened?
In 1970, there was a presidential election. It was a 3-way tie, so there was actually only about 33% of the vote, maybe 34%, that went to Salvador Allende. The Congress knew that he was a socialist, potentially communist, and they weren't too happy with it, but they had to grant it to him, the presidency, because he did have the most number of votes. He immediately went to turning the economy into communist society. He nationalized the mining industry, which is the number one industry in Chile, the copper mines, and then went to nationalizing, of course, the farmlands, which we've seen regularly too. And when you give lots of little people a piece of land to farm and make their own food, you know how that goes. Within 3 years, the country was at the point of starvation. They were receiving foreign aid in the way of food. And that's when the Congress convened, and the Congress brought in the military and asked them and told them, ordered them, take back this country. And so I do know that the CIA was involved in that, in helping them plan that. But there was a bombing of the presidential palace, and President Salvador Allende was either killed, somebody either shot him or he shot himself. Nobody really knows the facts on that. And so President Pinochet was one of the military leaders. They pretty much had a powwow between the 4 of them, and President Pinochet was elected to be the president and or military dictator, however you want to look at it, and he maintained power for 17 years. One of his first jobs was, of course, to chase out the communists or to eliminate communism from the country. It wasn't a pleasant thing. I don't think too many countries have successfully ever chased out communism bloodlessly. Yeah. There were 3,000 people murdered and or went missing. There were thousands of people who were tortured to find out who were the communists. But I think a pretty decent thing that they did was the military went to the doors of the families who they knew were communists, knocked on it and said, you have been identified as a communist. You have 24 hours to leave the country. And so there were tens of thousands of families that were forced out of Chile.
Mm. Yeah, it's a really interesting story. And one of the things that they found, I guess, when they were searching through the documents of the communist regime were lists of people they were planning to exterminate, things that they were planning to do to the people of Chile that were just horrifying. Basically, it was Cuba 2.0. Salvador Allende was a disciple of Fidel Castro, and their plan was to turn Chile into another Cuba. And because of Pinochet and because of the efforts of freedom-loving people in Chile, they were able to stop that transformation that would have really left Chile like any other communist hellhole where people are abused and murdered and put into gulags. And then Pinochet eventually handed back power, but they ended up with a constitution that was really quite remarkable. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know Milton Friedman, the American free market economist, was involved. So what happened in Chile under Pinochet to lay the groundwork for what eventually became, I've often heard it described as the economic miracle of Latin America?
Yes. I'm forgetting the person who wrote the Constitution. Did a very good job. It was mostly copied after the United States Constitution. Mm-hmm. Separate from that, they did send the best and the brightest from Chile to the Chicago School of Economics to learn free market economics, and they brought it back and implemented it. And whereas they were one of the poorest nations in Latin America with 70% poverty, by the 1990s they were down to 7% poverty. So it was a true economic miracle due to that and a good constitution.
Yeah. By far the wealthiest country in Latin America, huh? Not even a close second.
Right. I do have to say about the Constitution, it was written under a military dictator, and I do know that there were many things in the Constitution that kept him in power. So that was the one issue that the people objected to. But he was only in power for 17 years. He did voluntarily choose to accept a people's referendum after 17 years for the people to choose whether he stepped down or not. And he actually very narrowly lost that election. So close to half of the people actually appreciated and felt better knowing that Pinochet was in power. But when he did step down, it was voluntarily. And then the Congress went to look at the Constitution, and they spent years until 2005 amending the Constitution over 200 times and eliminating everything objectionable within the Constitution. And in 2005, the socialist president and the Congress agreed that this was a good constitution, and they re-signed this adapted and amended constitution in 2005. Everyone was happy with the constitution.
Yeah, it's really an interesting story. And then, we've talked on this program before about the network of Latin American communists that has been operating now for decades, founded by Fidel Castro, the communist dictator of Cuba, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, the FARC in Colombia, and Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva from Brazil, this communist network, and they actually helped bring the socialists back to power, Michelle Bachelet. And this came out, they were stealing money from Petrobras, the state-owned company, and funneling it through private companies and Odebrecht over to Michelle Bachelet to help her get into the presidency. And now we have a full-blown communist revolution, and now they're going to be rewriting their constitution. So tell us what's going on with the rewrite of the constitution.
Yeah. So my biggest shock was this peaceful nation never heard a complaint about their constitution ever. And 8 days after this total chaos broke out, 1 million people assembled. And one of the primary things that they were all shouting and yelling for was, "We want a new constitution." I kept asking the people, what specifically is wrong with your constitution? Well, nothing. It was just written under a dictator. And I said, but you do know it's all been amended. Everything out of that was taken out. Well, we don't care. It's a bad constitution. We need to rewrite it. And so when the president finally, after 6 weeks of total chaos, broke down and agreed to a people's referendum, that was when I decided to leave. I knew that was not going to end well. So what they had agreed to was if the people voted for this, then the people would get to write the Constitution. It would have to be 50% of them women to make it politically correct. The indigenous Indians have, I believe, 19 seats at the table to rewrite the Constitution. So right now they're in the process of electing or campaigning for who will be writing the Constitution. So this is a campaign. You are campaigning to be one of the writers of the Constitution. So the election will happen in April. They'll have a year to write the Constitution, and then it will be presented to the people. And again, a people's referendum, yes or no. And that's it.
Wow. And there are some very scary parallels there. We've only got a couple minutes left, but there are now multiple efforts in the United States to get rid of our Constitution. You've got conservatives saying that we need to amend the Constitution to restrain the federal government because apparently the original one doesn't restrain the federal government. I don't know. When I read it, it did. And then we have on the left the people saying, oh, it was written by people who own some slaves. And so
Racists.
exactly. We got to get rid of that. And so, we see the same type of thing, not as extreme, but we see people burning our cities. We see just this really a communist revolutionary spirit descending on at least the big cities in the United States. What are the parallels, and what do you think Americans can do and should do to resist and to try to protect the Constitution that we have that has been pretty effective in preserving our liberties.
How about read and understand and learn the Constitution?
That's a good start, huh?
It is exactly the same situation. The people believe that it's some magical document and there must be something wrong with it because we have problems. And if we just rewrite it, then all of these problems will go away. It's just not true. The problem is not the Constitution. The problem is us, the people.
And so what do you recommend that us, the people, do? What are some things that the American people can do to try to deal with? I mean, there are problems in America. I think everybody sees that. So what do we do to address those issues in a way that keeps our liberties intact, that keeps our really miraculous Constitution in place?
I would say enforce the Constitution. And in order to enforce the Constitution, you have to understand its proper limitations. Read, study the Constitution, read and follow the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers and understand why it was written and what the meaning and the purpose was behind that. Understand the principles of Americanism.
And so in the last minute that we have left, how do you work to do that? I know you're very active. You're organizing. You're educating the electorate. You were just on the radio. I saw it came across my newsfeed in Wyoming explaining why legislators there should not vote for calling it what they call a convention of states, which is just another term for a con-con. So what do you do, and how can people get involved in that effort?
Education. The John Birch Society is all about education. We have a constitutional course called Constitution is the Solution. They can follow that online. It's available for free. Understand states' rights. We have lots and lots of materials about states' rights and regaining and restoring the balance of power between the states and the federal government, and then educating and assisting your legislators in making that happen.
Leah, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your insight with us. What an incredible story. Folks, I hope you paid attention. I hope you will share this out because this is a critical issue. We don't want to end up in the same situation that the people in Chile are finding themselves in right now, and we especially don't want to end up in the situation that the people of Cuba and China and Germany and Vietnam and all these other countries around the world have found themselves in. And unfortunately, we didn't have time to talk about it. The deep state elite media has been critical in this process, not just in the United States, but even in Cuba. They were in the New York Times, the CFR operative who was writing there, Herbert Matthews, called him the George Washington of Latin America, and he was an anti-communist freedom fighter. So we need to be very careful. And I hope that you will get this out there. I hope you'll visit us at thenewamerican.com and stay tuned for next week. We will have more on solutions to the deep state problem. I'm Alex Newman. It's Behind the Deep State. Thanks for watching, and God bless. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe, hit like, hit that little bell so that you'll be notified whenever we post new videos. And also, please make sure to share this video with your friends. Email's a great way to do it. Remember, there are powerful forces working to steal our freedom and destroy our country. We need to work together, expose those behind the deep state. Otherwise, you can kiss your liberties goodbye.